The flight of destiny. The hum of the engines was a soft, steady presence in the background as the luxury first-class cabin of the transatlantic flight settled into a peaceful rhythm. Plush seats reclined at the touch of a button, and flight attendants bustled about, ensuring that each passenger was comfortable. Keanu Reeves sat quietly in his seat near the window, dressed in his usual simple style. A plain black t-shirt, well-worn jeans, and a pair of boots that had seen many miles. His hair was slightly tousled, and a few strands fell into his eyes as he looked out at the endless sky. He never demanded attention, nor did he carry an air of superiority despite his worldwide fame. He was just another traveler, hoping to get to his destination without fanfare. But not everyone saw it that way. Sitting directly across the aisle from him was a woman named Veronica Caldwell. She was a high-powered fashion executive, known for her sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of superiority. Dressed in a pristine designer dress, her diamond bracelet gleamed under the soft lighting, a silent testament to her wealth. Her presence alone commanded attention, something she had grown accustomed to. She had noticed Keanu the moment he sat down, but she didn't recognize him. She saw only a scruffy man in casual clothes, sitting in a first-class cabin, where, in her opinion, he clearly didn't belong. As the flight attendant walked by, Veronica leaned in with a smirk. "Excuse me, but I think there's been a mistake." The attendant, a young woman named Claire, paused. "A mistake, ma'am?" "Yes." Veronica gestured toward Keanu without even looking at him. "I believe he's in the wrong section. This is first class. Surely he must have wandered in by mistake." Claire's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing. "Oh no, ma'am. He's in the correct seat." Veronica scoffed. "You're telling me this man can afford first class? Look at him. He looks like he just walked in off the street." Keanu remained silent, his lips curling into a slight smile. He had heard it all before, and it didn't bother him. But Claire looked horrified. "Ma'am, I can assure you that all passengers here have valid tickets," Claire said in a polite but firm voice. Veronica rolled her eyes, shaking her head in disbelief. Unbelievable. Standards are really slipping these days. A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, having overheard the exchange. Some recognized Keanu instantly and whispered among themselves, but they didn't interfere. They wanted to see how this would unfold. Keanu turned to Veronica, his voice calm and composed. "Is there something about me that offends you?" Veronica snorted. "I don't expect to share first class with someone who doesn't even look like they belong here." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "And what does someone who belongs here look like?" She waved a hand dismissively. "Well-dressed, sophisticated. Someone successful." Keanu's smile deepened, but he said nothing. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a well-worn book, flipping it open as if she no longer existed. Annoyed by his lack of reaction, Veronica huffed and turned away, muttering under her breath. The flight continued smoothly for a while. Keanu remained immersed in his book, while Veronica occupied herself with a glass of champagne. Then, a sudden jolt rocked the cabin. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The plane trembled again, more violently this time. Gasps filled the cabin, and the hum of idle chatter ceased. Flight attendants rushed to secure carts and check on passengers. Veronica gripped her armrests, her confident demeanor cracking for the first time. "What's happening?" she demanded. Keanu closed his book and fastened his seatbelt. His expression remained calm, though his eyes showed quiet concern. The turbulence grew worse. Overhead compartments rattled, and a few oxygen masks dislodged momentarily before swinging back into place. A voice from the cockpit came again, this time tinged with urgency. "We're encountering unexpected weather complications. Please remain seated and stay calm." But calm was the last thing Veronica felt. Her breaths came quickly, her hands shaking. She had never experienced turbulence this severe before. Her fear was raw, primal. Keanu noticed. Without hesitation, he leaned slightly toward her, his voice soothing. "Hey, just breathe." She shot him a glare, though it was less intense than before. "I don't need your advice." Keanu didn't argue. Instead, he demonstrated, taking a slow, deep breath, exhaling just as slowly. Then another, and another. Veronica, despite herself, found her breath matching his rhythm. The turbulence persisted, but somehow, following his calmness, she felt steadier. Then, out of nowhere, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. The passengers collectively gasped. A few screamed. The plane dipped suddenly. Veronica's heart nearly stopped. Panic surged through her veins like ice. Keanu, however, remained grounded. "It's okay. The pilots are trained for situations like this." Veronica's lips trembled. What if it's not okay?" Keanu met her eyes. "Then we deal with it together." For the first time in her life, Veronica felt small, not because of wealth, not because of status, but because of the reality that, in that moment, none of it mattered. Not her designer dress, not her diamond bracelet, not her first-class ticket. Only survival mattered. The turbulence finally began to ease. The plane steadied. The overhead lights flickered back to their normal glow. A deep silence settled over the cabin as people processed what had just happened. Then, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've made it through the turbulence. We apologize for the scare. We'll be landing in approximately 1 hour. Thank you for your patience." The collective tension in the room released at once. Soft sighs, nervous chuckles. Veronica unclenched her fists. She turned to Keanu, something shifting inside her. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter than before. Keanu simply smiled. "Anytime." But the journey wasn't over yet, because what happened next would change Veronica's life forever. Unmasking the truth. As the plane settled into a calmer rhythm, the tension in the cabin gradually dissolved. Conversations resumed, though quieter than before, and the attendants moved about, ensuring that everyone was safe and comfortable. Veronica, however, remained still, her mind racing with the remnants of fear. She stole a glance at Keanu, who had returned to his book, as if nothing had happened. There was something infuriatingly peaceful about him, as though turbulence, condescending remarks, or the judgments of the world could not touch him. For the first time, she studied him properly. There was a quiet depth in his eyes, a kindness that didn't seem forced. He was different from the wealthy men she knew, men who flaunted their status, who walked with an air of importance. He wasn't draped in luxury brands, nor did he carry himself with arrogance. Instead, he was grounded. Feeling a strange pull of curiosity, she leaned slightly toward him. "You weren't scared, were you?" she asked, her voice softer than before. Keanu turned a page in his book before answering. "I was, but fear doesn't have to control you." Veronica frowned. "Easy for you to say." Keanu closed the book and looked at her directly. "It's not easy at all. It takes practice." His tone was gentle, but there was something behind it, a weight, an experience that went deeper than casual words. She hesitated. "Have you been through something like this before?" Keanu took a moment before replying. "Something like this? No, but I've had my share of storms." Veronica raised an eyebrow. "And yet you sit here, reading like nothing happened." He smiled, but there was a quiet sadness in it. What good would panicking do? Life doesn't always go the way we expect. Sometimes we just have to hold on and ride it through. His words sat with her in a way she didn't expect. She had spent her entire life fighting for control. Control over her career, her image, her surroundings. She had shaped her identity around power and prestige, believing that these things made her untouchable. But just moments ago, none of that had mattered. All her wealth, her designer clothes, her influence, it had meant nothing when the plane shook, when the reality of mortality set in. And yet here was this man, sitting in the same situation, unshaken. A flight attendant approached, offering refills on drinks. Veronica, still unsettled, ordered another champagne. Keanu, on the other hand, declined with a simple shake of his head. "You don't drink?" she asked, more out of curiosity than judgment. "Not really," he replied. "I used to, but not much anymore." She smirked. "Discipline, huh?" Keanu chuckled. "Something like that." The conversation paused as the pilot made another announcement, reassuring everyone that they were on track for a smooth landing. Veronica let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "So," she said after a moment, "what do you do?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. "I act." She raised an eyebrow. "Act? Like in local theaters or commercials?" A few passengers around them stifled laughs, exchanging knowing glances, but Veronica didn't notice. Keanu, however, remained composed. "A bit bigger than that," he said simply. Veronica scoffed lightly. "I see. One of those struggling actors trying to make it big. No offense, but first class is an expensive seat for someone in that position." Keanu didn't correct her. He just smiled. "I get by." Something about his modesty irritated her. If he wasn't wealthy, how had he afforded this seat? And if he was, why didn't he flaunt it? She had spent her career among the elite, where success was worn like a badge, where conversations revolved around status and luxury. Yet this man, whoever he was, didn't fit into any of those molds. "Must be nice," she said, sipping her champagne, having nothing to prove. Keanu's gaze lingered on her, as if seeing beyond her words. "And yet you do." Veronica stiffened. "Excuse me?" "You live like someone who's always proving something," he said, not unkindly. "Like you're carrying a weight you don't want anyone to see." A lump formed in her throat. She had spent years perfecting the art of confidence, of making sure no one ever saw past the surface. But this stranger, in just a few words, had cut straight through her carefully built armor. She forced a laugh. "And what, you're a therapist now?" Keanu shook his head, just observant. She shifted uncomfortably, feeling exposed in a way she wasn't used to. "Well," she said, forcing a smirk, "if you're such a great observer, tell me this. Why did you choose to fly first class, if you clearly don't care about appearances?" Keanu leaned back in his seat, considering the question. "Because I had enough miles to upgrade," he said, "and because I like the extra legroom." Veronica blinked, surprised by the simple answer. No grand explanation, no hidden agenda. Just practicality. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, an older woman a few rows ahead suddenly turned in her seat, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Oh my goodness, I thought you looked familiar," she said excitedly. "You're Keanu Reeves." The moment the name left the woman's mouth, a wave of recognition swept through the cabin. Passengers whispered, heads turned. A few murmured in awe, and others quickly pulled out their phones. Veronica felt her stomach drop. Keanu Reeves. Not a struggling actor, not some nobody. A world-famous, highly respected actor. She had insulted Keanu Reeves. Heat rushed to her cheeks as realization struck her like a tidal wave. The murmurs grew louder, and a few people even approached, politely asking for photos. Keanu, ever gracious, smiled and nodded, taking a moment to interact with those who approached him. Veronica sank into her seat, suddenly feeling very, very small. How had she not recognized him? How had she been so blind, so arrogant? And worst of all, how had he stayed so patient with her when she had been nothing but rude? She expected him to gloat, to throw her words back at her, to smirk in satisfaction at her embarrassment. But he didn't. Instead, as he settled back into his seat after a few brief interactions, he turned to her, the same calm expression on his face. No anger, no amusement at her humiliation, just kindness. "You okay?" he asked, as if she were the one in need of reassurance. Veronica swallowed hard. I didn't know." "You weren't supposed to," he said simply. She hesitated. "Why didn't you say anything?" He shrugged. "You didn't ask." A nervous laugh escaped her. "I guess I've been an idiot." Keanu smiled, his eyes warm. "We all have our moments." Veronica exhaled, sinking further into her seat, her mind spinning. She had judged him, dismissed him, humiliated herself, and yet he had never retaliated. No arrogance, no spite, just grace. And for the first time in her life, Veronica Caldwell, powerful, successful, always in control, felt humbled. And somehow, she knew this was just the beginning. The weight of reflection. The energy in the first-class cabin had shifted. Before, it had been quiet luxury, detached, indifferent, a space where status mattered more than connection. But now, there was an undercurrent of quiet excitement. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, some stealing glances at Keanu, while others, emboldened by the revelation, approached him with hesitant smiles. He responded with the same calm grace he always carried, offering warm smiles and easy conversation. Veronica, however, remained frozen in her seat, replaying every word she had spoken to him before she knew the truth. Every insult, every assumption, every ounce of arrogance she had thrown his way now weighed on her like an anchor. She had always been in control, always the one looking down from her pedestal of wealth and power. But now, she felt like a fool, a woman who had judged someone not by their character, but by their clothes. A flight attendant, now aware of Keanu's presence, approached with an almost reverent smile. "Mr. Reeves, would you like anything special? A drink, perhaps?" He shook his head politely. "Just water, please." Veronica noticed how he never demanded anything, never acted entitled to special treatment. He simply existed in the moment, as if he was no different from anyone else in the cabin, despite the obvious admiration surrounding him. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Why did this bother her so much? It wasn't just embarrassment, it was something deeper. For years, she had defined people by their status. She had climbed her way to the top in the ruthless fashion industry, where money and image ruled everything. She had worked tirelessly to ensure she was always among the elite, always untouchable. And yet here was a man who had more wealth, more fame, and more influence than she could ever dream of, yet he carried none of the arrogance she had surrounded herself with. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to speak. "I owe you an apology." Keanu turned to her, his expression unreadable. "For what?" She swallowed. "For assuming you didn't belong here. For everything I said earlier." His eyes studied her for a moment before he smiled lightly. "I wasn't offended." That made it worse. Veronica exhaled sharply. "You should have been. I was rude, judgmental. If someone spoke to me like that, I'd never let them live it down." Keanu shrugged. Holding on to resentment takes more energy than letting it go. His words landed like a punch to her gut. Resentment. She knew the weight of it all too well. For years, she had carried it. Resentment toward those who had underestimated her, those who had once looked down on her before she built herself into someone powerful. She had used that resentment as fuel, as proof that she needed to fight harder, climb higher, never let herself be in a position where anyone could belittle her. And yet, here was a man who had likely been judged 1,000,000 times over, who had suffered more than she could possibly know. Yet he held no bitterness. She looked at him again, really looked at him. His face was familiar now, not just because he was famous, but because there was something in his eyes that spoke of stories untold. He had seen life in ways she hadn't, and yet he remained kind. Veronica hesitated before speaking again. "How do you do it?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Do what?" "Stay grounded. After everything, after all the fame, the money. How do you stay this way?" He considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because I know what really matters." Veronica frowned. "And what's that?" He smiled, but this time there was something sad behind it. "The people you love. the time you have, the way you make others feel. Her breath hitched slightly. She wasn't sure what response she had expected. Something superficial, something rehearsed. But this was different. Keanu leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the window. "I've lost a lot of people," he said, his voice quieter now. "People I love more than anything." Veronica felt a lump in her throat. She had heard the rumors before, of course. The stories about his tragic past, the loss he had endured. But hearing it now, from his own lips, made it feel different. "I'm sorry," she murmured, and for the first time in a long time, she actually meant it. Keanu gave a small nod, acknowledging her sincerity. "Loss changes you. It makes you see what's real and what isn't." He turned to her again. "Most of the things people chase, the status, the money, the power, it doesn't mean anything if you don't have something real to hold on to." Veronica felt her chest tighten. For years, she had been chasing something. Success, validation, the feeling of being untouchable. But what had it given her? A penthouse apartment that felt empty. A closet full of designer clothes she barely cared about. A reputation built on fear rather than respect. And now, sitting here, next to a man who had every reason to be consumed by fame and fortune, but had chosen a different path, she realized something terrifying. She had been chasing the wrong things. She had built a life that looked perfect on the outside, but felt hollow on the inside. The weight of that realization settled in her stomach like a stone. For the rest of the flight, Veronica sat in silence, lost in thought. The conversations around them faded, and Keanu returned to his book, giving her the space to process. And for the first time in a long time, Veronica Caldwell felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Not power, not superiority, but vulnerability. And somehow, she knew, this flight, this conversation, this moment was going to change everything. A mirror to the soul, Veronica stared blankly at the seat in front of her, her mind tangled in thoughts she couldn't untangle. The cabin, though filled with soft murmurs and the occasional clinking of glasses, felt eerily silent in her head. She had spent the majority of her adult life perfecting an image, one of power, control, and untouchable confidence. And yet, in the span of a few hours, a stranger, no, Keanu Reeves, had unraveled her without even trying. She had never felt this exposed before. She turned her gaze toward him, watching as he read, completely at peace, as though their conversation had not just upended her entire perspective on life. The way he carried himself, the quiet dignity, the absence of arrogance. How did a man so famous, so wealthy, remain so unbothered by things that consumed others? Veronica shifted in her seat. "So, what happens when you stop chasing things?" she asked, surprising even herself. Keanu closed his book, his fingers lingering on the pages before he turned to her. "You start living." The answer was so simple, yet it hit her like a wave. She let out a soft scoff, shaking her head. "That sounds easy for you to say." Keanu chuckled. "It's not easy at all." His eyes softened. "You just have to decide what kind of life you want to live." Veronica frowned, feeling an unfamiliar weight in her chest. And what if you've spent your whole life chasing something, only to realize it was the wrong thing? Keanu leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Then you change direction." Her lips parted slightly, but she had no response. Change direction. Was it really that simple? She had spent years, decades even, clawing her way to the top, ensuring she was untouchable, respected, feared. But what had it given her, really? Loneliness? A reputation built on intimidation rather than admiration. A life where the only thing she feared more than failure was the idea of someone seeing through the cracks in her armor. She swallowed hard. "I don't think I even know who I am outside of all this," she admitted, almost whispering the words. Keanu didn't look at her with pity. Instead, there was understanding. "Then maybe it's time to find out." The thought terrified her. Veronica had spent her entire life building herself into someone she thought she needed to be. She had played the game, followed the rules of success, cultivated a persona that made her untouchable. But now, sitting in a first-class seat beside a man who had no need for pretense, she felt the first cracks in the walls she had built around herself. The flight attendant returned, offering them both refreshments. Veronica reached for another champagne but hesitated. The bubbling golden liquid suddenly felt like a crutch rather than a luxury. Instead, she took a deep breath and asked for water. Keanu smiled slightly, as if he noticed the shift, but he said nothing. She sipped the cool water, letting the silence settle between them. Finally, she spoke again. "Have you ever had to start over?" Keanu's expression grew distant for a moment, more times than I can count. She hesitated. "How do you do it?" He was quiet for a moment before answering. "You take what you've learned, and you keep moving forward. You don't let the past define you." Veronica exhaled, gripping her water glass a little tighter. "That's easier said than done." Keanu's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Most things are." She let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. "You make it sound like you have it all figured out." Keanu shook his head. "No one has it all figured out. But I've learned that the things people think matter. Money, status, power, they're not what makes life meaningful." He glanced out the window. "The people we love, the way we treat others, the moments that remind us we're alive. That's what matters." Veronica felt something tighten in her chest. She thought about the people in her life, colleagues who only respected her out of fear, acquaintances who admired her success, but never truly knew her. Who, in her life, had she truly loved? And who had truly loved her? The realization settled over her like a heavy fog. For years, she had been chasing a version of success that had left her isolated. She had built a fortress around herself, thinking it would protect her, but instead, it had only trapped her inside. She turned back to Keanu, searching his face for something. Wisdom, guidance, maybe even absolution. "Do you ever regret the things you've lost?" His gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't before. A sadness, deep and profound, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken memories. "All the time," he admitted. "But I don't let regret stop me from living." Veronica felt her breath hitch. She had spent years trapped in regret. Regret of not being good enough, of needing to prove herself, of sacrificing her happiness for an image. For the first time, she wondered, what if she stopped? What if she let go of the things that didn't serve her? What if she, like Keanu, chose to live for something real? She wasn't sure she knew how. But for the first time, she thought, maybe, just maybe, she was ready to try. The plane began its descent, and Veronica looked out the window, watching as the city lights came into view. A new destination, a new beginning, and maybe, just maybe, a new her. The weight of change. The plane dipped lower, the shimmering city lights sprawling beneath them like a sea of golden veins, each one pulsing with the life of people who had no idea that thousands of feet above them, a woman was quietly unraveling. Veronica's fingers tightened around the armrest as her thoughts churned like a storm. For the first time in years, she wasn't worried about her next meeting, the next deal, or the next power move. Instead, she was staring at the hollow structure of her own life, realizing that it had been built on illusions. How had she not seen it before? Perhaps because admitting it meant acknowledging that she had spent decades chasing something that had never truly mattered. She turned to Keanu, her lips parting slightly, then pressing shut. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. What could she even say? I don't know who I am without the persona I created. I'm terrified that if I strip everything away, there'll be nothing left. He glanced at her, sensing the storm inside her, but he didn't push. Instead, he simply nodded toward the window. Beautiful, isn't it? Veronica blinked. What? Keanu gestured toward the city. The lights. the way they stretch forever. She turned, really looking this time. The vastness of the view suddenly felt overwhelming. Millions of lives, millions of stories happening all at once, and here she was, one of them, just another soul trying to figure it all out. She let out a slow breath. Yeah, it is. The plane shuddered slightly as the landing gear deployed, and the captain's voice crackled over the speakers, instructing passengers to prepare for arrival. Veronica straightened in her seat, but the knot in her stomach tightened. Something was different now. She wasn't the same woman who had boarded this flight, dripping in superiority, armed with judgment, convinced that the world operated in a hierarchy of wealth and status. No, something had shifted. Or rather, she had shifted. She stole another glance at Keanu, who was calmly fastening his seatbelt, exuding the same effortless peace that had rattled her from the start. He had no idea what he had done to her, how he had cracked her open with nothing but quiet wisdom and kindness. And maybe that was what unsettled her the most. For years, she had believed in power, control, dominance. And yet, here was a man who had none of those things by force. And yet he had changed her, without ever trying. As the wheels touched down with a soft jolt, the cabin buzzed with the energy of people eager to disembark, returning to their own lives, their own stories. Veronica, however, remained still. She had spent her entire life making sure she was somebody. A name, a force, a reputation. But now, for the first time, she wondered what it would be like to simply be. To live, not for status or approval, but for something real. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. As passengers stood, gathering their belongings, she turned to Keanu. "I have no idea what to do with everything you've said to me," she admitted with a small, self-deprecating laugh. He smiled, unbuckling his seatbelt. "You don't have to do anything right now." She hesitated. "Then what do I do?" Keanu reached for his bag, slinging it over his shoulder before looking at her one last time. "Start by being honest with yourself." The words landed deeper than she expected. Honest with herself. When was the last time she had done that? As Keanu moved down the aisle, stopping occasionally to shake hands and smile at passengers who now recognized him, Veronica remained seated, watching him go. He had no idea what he had done. Or maybe he did. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. As she finally stood to leave, she took a deep breath, stepping off the plane into a world that somehow didn't look the same as when she had boarded. Because for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the same. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what she needed. A new chapter begins. The terminal buzzed with life. Travelers rushing to their gates, families reuniting, business professionals hurrying toward waiting cars. The smell of coffee and jet fuel lingered in the air, blending into the familiar chaos of an airport. Yet, for Veronica, the world outside the plane felt strangely different. She stepped onto the glossy floor of the arrival terminal, her designer heels clicking against the tiles. Normally, she would walk with purpose, her posture rigid, her presence commanding attention. But now, she found herself hesitating, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. Keanu was already ahead, moving through the crowd with effortless ease, his black duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't rush, didn't demand space. He simply existed within it, moving with the natural rhythm of the world around him. Veronica hesitated, something inside her warring between wanting to call out to him and letting him disappear into the sea of people. He had already given her more than she had ever asked for. Maybe it was enough. Maybe she didn't need to say anything more. And yet, the fear of letting this moment, this strange, unexpected awakening, slip through her fingers gnawed at her. Before she could second-guess herself, she quickened her pace, weaving through the crowd until she was beside him. "You're really just going to walk away and disappear into the city like some mysterious wanderer, huh?" she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Keanu turned to her, amusement flickering in his eyes. "I was planning on getting a cab, actually." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Of course you were. They walked in silence for a moment, the automatic glass doors ahead sliding open to reveal the cool night air. The world outside stretched before them, a city full of people who had no idea how much had changed for one woman in the span of a single flight. Veronica sighed, shoving her hands into the pockets of her expensive coat. "I don't know what to do with all of this," she admitted, motioning vaguely as if referring to the entire existential shift happening inside her. Keanu looked at her, his gaze steady. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight." She exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yeah, I guess not." A long pause stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of traffic. She didn't want to ask the question that had been burning in her mind, but she knew she had to. "Do you ever think about how one moment can change everything?" Keanu's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "All the time." She bit her lip, hesitating before speaking again. "What if I don't know where to go from here?" He shifted his bag on his shoulder. "Then take one step. Just one. One step." It sounded so simple, yet it carried so much weight. For years, her steps had always been calculated, part of a grand strategy to climb higher, to secure more, to prove something. But this wasn't about strategy. This was about something far more personal. She turned to him, meeting his gaze fully. "Thank you." Keanu nodded, his expression warm but unreadable. "Take care, Veronica." And with that, he stepped toward the curb, raising a hand to hail a cab. She watched as the yellow car pulled up, the driver loading his bag into the trunk. As Keanu opened the door, he hesitated for just a fraction of a second, as if sensing her lingering thoughts. Then, without another word, he slid inside, and the cab pulled away into the night. Veronica stood there for a long moment, watching the taillights disappear into the flow of traffic. She had come onto this flight thinking she was untouchable, invincible. And yet, a single conversation had unraveled years of carefully constructed illusions. One step. That was all it took. A slow breath escaped her lips as she turned toward the city skyline, the towering buildings standing like silent witnesses to the infinite possibilities ahead. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking up at them as a battlefield to conquer. She was just looking. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something real.